listening to the World Soccer Talk podcast, the only podcast about watching soccer on TV and online. Welcome to episode 158. Coming up on this week's show, our thoughts on the Premier League's new streaming strategy. Fox Sports goes to the dogs. LaLiga springs a surprise with their TV ratings. Bundesliga can't get out of first gear in the US. Plus we have letters from you, the listeners, in our mailbag section. I'm Christopher Harris, aka The Gaffer, alongside Kartik Krishnaiyer. How's it going, Kartik?
It's going well. How are you, Chris?
I'm doing well. It's this past week. I mean, we go through. I mean, throughout the entire year, we do the podcast. There's no break. I mean, even over the holidays during the summer. Some weeks are better than others in terms of matches that are on television. We've had a couple of weeks, I think, recently where it was really difficult to actually try to find a game that stood out, especially during FA Cup weekends. This particular past week has been amazing. Lots of different things to talk about, but let's have you start off with your favorite match of the week.
Oh, I mean, I guess you can. Favorite may not be the best match to watch was Leverkusen Dortmund, but I'm not sure it was my favorite match of the week because I'm hoping Dortmund makes a run at this title, and this was a horrible setback for them. Have to though mention, Chris, that you and I were treated so well when we went to Leverkusen a few years ago, right? To meet with the board and the hierarchy of Bayer Leverkusen. We took in a game there against Schalke. Yep. So I do have a soft spot for that club. I genuinely like Peter Bosz. And I thought at Dortmund maybe they sacked him a little too soon. But this match was very frustrating. 4-3 match, a match that went back and forth. There were 3 disallowed goals also, and there were several shots that I can think of one on each side that hit the post also or hit woodwork. So just an open, entertaining match, but another frustrating example of Dortmund's inability to hold a lead in a match. So I'm watching this match straight through. I started out trying to flip back and forth with the Forest Leeds match, which was a huge game going on in the championship. That was kind of blah. Forest really had control of the match. Leeds, I mean, we could talk about, maybe this isn't the venue to talk about Leeds' kind of recent dip in form, but
it could be. We could talk about Leeds if you want to, but yeah, it's a tough league.
Yeah. So I had started out flipping back and forth. Then I focused exclusively on the Leverkusen Dortmund match, saw the goals, saw the disallowed goals. I said, you know what? Maybe I should check NBC and see what's happening in the Watford-Brighton game, right? It was Watford? No, it was Brighton. Was it Watford-Brighton?
Yeah, it was.
Watford-Brighton match.
Right.
So let me check what's going on in that match. I haven't even checked the score. I haven't done anything. And it's 3-2 at this point. Dortmund is winning. Jadon Sancho's had a really spectacular goal chalked off because of foul off the ball, which happened in the build-up, or actually even kind of before the build-up. But VAR in Germany works really quickly. The referee got buzzed. He went and looked and chalked off the goal, even though it was a spectacular goal. If it had been in England, it would have been a 3-minute delay and all kinds of confusion. So I switch. I see the score. I go to my refrigerator to get a can of seltzer water. So literally like a minute and a half, and I'm like, oh boy, it's 1-1. I better switch back to the Bundesliga match. Switch back, and it's 4-3 all of a sudden. Leverkusen, it had been 3-2 when I switched. They scored 2 goals. So there was a goal that, and it turned out, I guess I missed, I think 3 goals, because there was a goal that was disallowed, and then there were 2 more goals that came that were fine from Leverkusen, and Dortmund didn't get back into it. And I guess Gio Reyna got a full half of play for American fans because Julian Brandt got hurt at halftime. Reyna wasn't bad, but again, there is some issue with these players at Dortmund, these attacking players defending properly. And what we see happen time and again is that Dortmund gets undone on counterattacks. They have so much of the ball that they don't give the ball up. There are not that many chances for the opposition, except when they play Bayern, right? But what we don't see is the tactical fouling that we see from Manchester City when Manchester City loses possession, which I have to say, I know people, City fans get very angry at me on Twitter, but I have to say I think it's gotten really sinister and cynical. And you could see City's intent every time they lose the ball is to foul. And that's how Zinchenko got sent off in that match against Spurs was, well, that's what you do. That's what I think they're taught to do. They're programmed to pull a guy down. And the reality is he had already had a yellow for dissent, not for an actual physical foul. But yeah, so that was definitely the best match to watch this weekend. Unfortunate if you're a Dortmund fan.
Yeah, I would say after watching Werder Bremen against Dortmund the week before in the Pokal Cup and how bad the defense was in that, but how entertaining the game was, Dortmund has now become probably one of the most entertaining teams to watch just because they're going to score a bunch of goals and they're going to concede a lot also. If you're the manager or if you're the chairman, it's going to be a very frustrating experience, but certainly entertaining. My favorite game for this...
I don't. One quick point. I don't understand it because Favre is supposed to be this incredibly detail-oriented manager that he spends time on the training ground scrutinizing every little thing, and yet Dortmund keep making the same sort of defensive errors week in and week out. Going back, this thing started after the winter break last season. I think people have now forgotten. Because they see the table from last one, like, oh, Dortmund ran them close, right? They almost won the title. That they had an 8-point lead or something when over Munich. Mönchengladbach was in between them, but over Bayern when it went to winter break last year. And this started happening last season. They would have leads in matches, 2-1, 1-0, and they conceded in the second half. And I tweeted earlier in the week, I don't think there's been any team that I remember in football in the history of football, since I've been watching, that have dropped as many points from winning positions in second halves of matches over the last now 14 months or 13 months since the winter break last year than Dortmund has. It's incredible how, and I think that's probably mental at this point.
Yeah, Lucien Favre has got to be pulling his hair out. I mean, that's one of the things, though, Kartik, too. I could see it in terms of, say, a team leading 1-0 and then losing the games 2-1. But oftentimes it seems that, Dortmund are leading 2-0 or 3-0, and then the other team comes back and wins it, 3-2 or 4-3. It is pretty incredible when you think about it. And I can't think of any other team that has been that way. But it is entertaining if you're the neutral, for sure. If you're a Dortmund fan, you got to be just so frustrated in so many different ways. So my favorite match, Kartik, from this past week was Inter against Milan in the derby. This was an absolutely incredible game. Obviously, Inter the favourites going into this match, but in a derby, you never know what's going to happen. And lo and behold, Milan scored the opening goal. Actually, I think by about halftime or so, it was like 2-0 to go up. And then Inter come back. I mean, just really entertaining. Fantastic action at both ends of the pitch. And I particularly loved the commentary by Mark Donaldson. There was so much force in his voice that captured the mood and intensity of this game and what it meant to both teams for different reasons. I mean, Inter hoping to win the Serie A title neck and neck with Juventus. Milan really kind of on the rebound, just trying to get back to, qualifying for Europe, trying to get back into being a big club in Italy. And this one, Mark Donaldson after this game must have, I don't know, had to take a nap or something, because the amount of energy he gave into this commentary, you could tell it was passionate. It almost blew me away in terms of the intensity, and that summed up the game. The game was fantastic to watch. As somebody who watches a lot of the Premier League, it's entertaining too, because you have so many of these footballers from the Premier League that are now playing for Inter. And you could say Zlatan too, playing for Milan, but Ashley Young and Lukaku and some of the defenders. I mean, it's kind of almost like a Premier League all-star team, but a great game, great atmosphere. I think about 80,000 people in the stadium, and ESPN Plus. I mean, it was just really, really good, really entertaining. And has now gotten me back into Serie A. I mean, over the weekend, I watched Verona against Juventus, and Verona again.
Yeah.
This was another good game. Dave Farrar and Stuart Robson on the commentary, two of my favorite commentators. and sensational goal by Ronaldo to give the 1-0 lead. But Verona won this 2-1 after a late penalty. Second great game in a row for Verona. I think the game before that they tied 0-0 with Milan. But Verona is a great team to watch too.
Yeah, Sarri's in trouble as Juventus manager. Conte has done a brilliant job with Inter, and we see all the former Premier League players he's brought in. Victor Moses having a huge contribution actually in that derby as well, Milan derby. Ashley Young playing for them now. He wanted to bring Olivier Giroud. There's a hot rumor about a coaching change at Juventus. Sarri could be out. And lo and behold, Max Allegri, who is still under contract, still being paid off, they might as well just let him coach since they're paying him off. So that rumor has begun to circulate this week, and I would not be shocked if that happened. And Allegri has the tactical nous to go toe-to-toe with Conte. I think the thing we've found about Mauricio Sarri is that he has a system that's very entertaining, but you need the right pieces to play it. It's also a system, as we saw with Ancelotti when he took over Napoli, that isn't easily replicated with another manager or another set of tactics. So that's pretty interesting. Should also mention, Chris, while we're reviewing what we watched this week, I watched Everton against Crystal Palace, and this is a conversation maybe for another time or as things develop, but the job Ancelotti has done in terms of getting Everton to play in kind of the way his Milan teams did in the mid-2000s, just stylistically and formation-wise. We saw Ancelotti experiment with all kinds of different tactical formations, all kinds of different things while he was at Chelsea. And then Chelsea, we saw him try a diamond and go to a 4-3-3. Real Madrid, the tactics, they had so much talent. He just had to fit the formation to the players he had. Bayern, he inherited a team from Pep that played a certain way. Couldn't really bottle that up and replicate that. And then Napoli, we just talked about taking over Sarri's team that played a very distinct style in a 4-3-3. What we've seen Ancelotti do at Everton, and was especially noticeable in this match, is revert to that 4-4-2 he had at Milan, and it's working. And I didn't think it would work in the Premier League in this era.
Yeah, the scoreline, it sounds like it's a convincing win for Everton, though, 3-1. And this one was pretty close. I mean, it was at the 2-1 with about 10 minutes to go. It just seemed that Palace was on the verge of getting an equaliser to tie it 2-2. But yeah, it's working. In some ways, though, too, for Ancelotti, I mean, he has the players at his disposal. He has some good players on that squad. They've just been playing awful pretty much all season. But yeah, I'm glad to see that things are working out there for the Toffees. One more thing I'll mention, Kartik, before we move on, is something else to give high praise for, and that was last week's Copa Del Rey Games. And there were two. And in Copa del Rey, in the quarterfinals, it's a single elimination. If you lose, you're out. And this really gave two incredible matches. The first one was Real Madrid against Real Sociedad. And Alexander Isaac with a man of the match performance for Real Sociedad. Crazy match with really poor defending. It reminded me of watching some of the Bundesliga with Dortmund, but the final score was Real Madrid 3, Real Sociedad.
Isaac came from Dortmund. Actually,
that explains it. Real Sociedad 4, and they're through to the semi-final. So, and the semi-final is two-leg, and with it being two legs, the first leg is oftentimes now for the semi-final pretty boring. In the other game, Athletic against Barcelona. Another shocker in the Copa del Rey, and Athletic winning this 1-0 in injury time. So both Barcelona and Real Madrid get knocked out, and there's a prospect of a Real Sociedad Athletic final if both of those teams can get through, and that'll be an all-Basque final. So that's going to be a joy to watch. I mean, it's going to be for that region. It should be really entertaining. All right, Kartik, let's move on to TV streaming news. And this one's a really interesting one. I want to hear you give kind of just the background first of what's going on, but I also want to get your opinion on this one. Yeah,
so there's news this week about Premflix, which would be a Netflix-like service for the Premier League. And now the Premier League has a new chief executive, just came on the job, I want to say, within the last 2 or 3 weeks, right? And this is the first major initiative. And it's it seems like a really, really cool concept, and you're going to get a backlog of tons of Premier League programming, ancillary programming, historical film, etc., potentially with this service. But Chris, of course, the question has to be now. Once again, you're paying more for the Premier League, and if you think about it, for viewers in certain countries, they're already, including the UK itself, you're already paying a ridiculous amount just to access the league. So I think it is where the space is going, the sports space is going, and some defined league-specific channels. We've seen LaLiga do this also, although LaLiga has a bunch of other things with their service that they package in it. But I think it's an interesting concept. I think it's really cool. I also worry about now the cost continuing to rise for supporters. But based on what we heard, Chris, I think this is happening.
Well, just to be clear, though, Kartik, this is a direct-to-consumer streaming offering. So what they're saying is that in certain markets around the world, for example, if it's Australasia, as one example, and Australasia says, okay, for the next round of bidding for the Premier League, and you might have Fox down in Australia, as well as some of the other ABC, the Australian Broadcasting Company, bidding on the rights to televise the Premier League, is that one of the options that the Premier League could go with is saying, okay, well, the bids from ABC and Fox, hypothetically, are not really kind of the numbers we're looking for. So we're going to go ahead and have a direct-to-consumer streaming product that's available to people in Australia to watch every single match of the Premier League, as well as Premier League TV 24/7. And we're going to just bypass the TV broadcasters completely and offer that to subscribers for, I think, I don't know if it's like £10, I think it was some of the numbers they've mentioned, a month or something like that. So what this does, this changes everything as a concept. So this is something that the Premier League doesn't have in place yet. They are looking at and working on this. But in many ways, this could be used as leverage. So, for example, and this could be something that they could roll out anywhere in the world. So if we go back to North America, to the United States of America, in the next TV deal, in theory, the Premier League could say, okay, you mean the bids from Fox or CBS or NBC, of course, maybe ESPN. Again, those numbers may not be. I mean, they have that in the back pocket to say, okay, we can actually use this as leverage in the negotiations to say, you know what, we can actually make more money from having a direct-to-consumer product than going ahead and getting this bid of however many hundreds of millions from some ESPN, for example. So it is interesting because when they announced it, it was reported, I think, in the Daily Mail. I think it was on Monday or Tuesday. Richard Masters, the new Premier League CEO, was really enthusiastic. Was really, really positive about talking about the possibility of direct-to-consumer bypassing TV. And then the next day, there was a follow-up piece, and then this was, I think, Bush was his name, another person within the Premier League saying, okay, kind of just downplaying it slightly, saying that the focus really is, that the preference is really rights deals over direct-to-consumer. So my guess is that there was probably a lot of phone calls, panic from the TV broadcasters saying, what the hell are you doing here? We're paying you, I mean, in the case of NBC, $1 billion over 6 years to have the rights. And now you're saying that there could be a direct-to-consumer model coming down the path for the next rights deal. Anyway, so they changed their tune really quickly and focused it on, yes, the priority is traditional television. But, I mean, to me, in terms of what this is, Kartik, I think in many ways, to me, it's FIFA TV. FIFA has launched their own TV OTT service. UEFA has launched their own OTT service. And UEFA in certain countries can offer a direct-to-consumer model. So, for example, if it's, I don't know, Eastern Europe as one hypothetical example, if the amount of people bidding on the rights are too low, they can say, we'll just go direct-to-consumer. We'll have our own UEFA TV channel and available online and broadcast the games that way. What do you think, Kartik? Do you think this is the future, or do you think this is... Yeah. I mean, can you see this happening in the next few years?
Yes.
Someplace?
Yeah, no. I think it is the future. I think it's also the Premier League. Look, the Premier League is hitting a point with rights, and I guess maybe I should have said this at the outset, because I think this is part of what's motivating it. The rights fees are now stagnant in the UK. International markets, they're continuing to grow, but that's mostly because of China specifically. So they're hitting a point of potential diminishing returns in direct TV rights deals. We'll see what NBC or whoever else bids this time for the next 3 years bids. But my guess is, and I know you've spent some time talking to NBC people recently, some good articles this week, Andres Cantor and Rebecca Lowe, among others, on the World Soccer Talk site. But I think that the rights fee doesn't go up substantially. It may not go up at all. It might go up just slightly in the U.S. this next time. So I think this is a hedge against that, and a very smart hedge, and I think it'll work. And it's the way things are going, and consumers will have to vote with their pocketbook. Do they want to that's an election acronym, right? Vote with your pocketbook. But they're going to have to make a decision with their disposable income, whether they want to part with a little more of it for this sort of service, direct-to-consumer service, or if they're going to watch less of the Premier League. And I think that's ultimately the decision they're going to have to make in a few years.
Yeah, I think for this next rights cycle, for both Major League Soccer and for the Premier League, it's going to get a boost because it's actually going to go up in terms of the value. Because there's more competition, because now you have the Amazon Primes of the world that are ready to go. You've got CBS All Access. You've got a lot more competition in the streaming space. And I think DAZN is another one too that's always been talked about that hasn't really entered the US market for soccer yet. There's a lot more competition among those tech companies that have enormous VC capital that they can put into this, even if it's losing money. And oftentimes when the Premier League, it comes up for bidding, oftentimes instead of going with the partner that's going to help them in the long run, they go after the money. And it's the same thing with Major League Soccer too. Major League Soccer, instead of staying with NBC, they decided to go for the money, and they lost NBC as a result of that. So I can see that happening. The actual value rights of the next TV rights cycle going up just because of the competition, not because of the return on investment. But the one last thing to Kartik about this Premflix, which is a horrible name, which is I think the name that the Daily Mail coined as something easy, memorable way to actually talk about this. Premflix is not the name of it. I'm concerned about this for the Premier League, from the Premier League's point of view, because the one thing that could absolutely kill this direct-to-consumer model is illegal streaming. So if you go into, you say, okay, right, TV money, thanks, but no thanks, we're going direct-to-consumer. And if direct-to-consumer is then in direct competition to illegal streaming, right now, illegal streaming is going to win this one.
Okay, is that the impression you have right now in the U.S. regarding NBC Sports Gold?
For sure.
Or is that because generally those are matches less people are interested in that? Wow. But I'm curious. Or ESPN Plus for the Serie A. Do you think there's a more illegal streaming of Serie A matches since the entire league now is behind a paywall, and the same thing will happen with Bundesliga next year?
I think in terms of the availability, it hasn't changed. The availability before and now, even with streaming only services, is the same as it was before, where every single game is available. So it was available before when it was on television. It's still available now. I mean, I've seen this in action. I've seen this, whether it's a Cody box and having every single ESPN Plus game listed, every single Sky game listed, every single Be Out queue, you name it. Any game you want to watch, it is available for free illegally. And that's the concern I have about this, is that, and maybe that's the reason why the Premier League kind of pulled back a little bit the day after, when one of the executives named Bush said, okay, no. Our priority is the TV rights deals over direct-to-consumer, because we're not at a place right now where they can be confident completely that they can really get rid of the illegal streaming. It's still an issue that's as pervasive now as it was before. Kartik, all right, let's move on to the next news item. And this is kind of a fun one, actually a little bit different on a slower week in terms of news. But I'm going to ask you this one, Kartik. According to one of my sources, I was talking about NBC's coverage of the Premier League. And we were talking about some of the names of the people, some of the names of the studio analysts that were considered for the Premier League talent when they launched in 2013, and they launched with the two Robbies, Carl Martino, Rebecca Lowe. Is in the work building up to that, NBC went through a long list of people that they considered for the job, for that studio analysis. Any guesses of anyone out there that might have been available that you think that they may have considered?
Well, I would hope they consider Derek Ray. That would be a logical one. Press Pass was winding down at that time with ESPN. Maybe they considered Shaka Hislop to be studio talent, because he was already in Connecticut and he knows that league as well as anybody on U.S. soil. So I would hope they considered him. Musto and Earl were on that same show. So obviously they were brought in. Let me think. Who else could have been considered at that point? I'm not really sure who else. I mean, I think obviously they probably the ESPN deal with Ian Dark was extended well past 2013. So I'm not sure if they were able to actually make that consideration. And maybe Dark used it as leverage, because we know prior to World Cup 2014, the Brazil World Cup, Dark got a new ESPN deal. Perhaps Steve McManaman. I don't know.
Yeah, all good names, and some of those may have been considered. I'm not sure. Derek Ray might have been still working in Scotland for the BBC at that point. I can't remember. Oh, it was BT Sport, I think it would have been.
BT.
Yeah, BT Sport. So it may have been a kind of he was under contract perhaps. But two of the names I do know for sure, and I had these confirmed. I want to get your takes on this one. First one was considered, but they decided not to go with this one, was Andy Gray.
That's a very, very wise decision. And I think, NBC, now this is all in hindsight, NBC has had a big problem with Harvey Weinstein and with Matt Lauer and some other potential sexual harassment scandals. If you read Ronan Farrow's excellent works, the journalist Ronan Farrow, who actually used to work for NBC himself, NBC News, he's exposed a lot of this. So it would have been really problematic. Not that Andy Gray has sexual harassment necessarily, but his comments about Sean Massey, who, by the way, I mean, now 10 years later, however many years later, is, I think, one of the elite Premier League lines assistant referees.
She's still an assistant referee, but they still will not call her.
She's one of the best ARs.
I know, but
I never see her offside calls getting reversed by VAR.
Right.
And, there was a lot of matches she does. She's really good. So Gray would have been a horrible error. And I also think the thing about Andy Gray is that he was really good in explaining things on chalkboards and stuff in terms of tactics, but what the level of analytical detail that Robbie Mustoe in particular brings to the show, I think, is a little beyond that. So, maybe he could have flanked Mustoe and added something, but I think that was a very, very lucky move that NBC for them.
Yeah.
That they didn't hire him.
It would have changed the chemistry on that set for sure with the studio team that they have. The second name, Kartik, I want to get your take on this one, was somebody that was considered, but they decided not to, and that was Glenn Hoddle.
That would have been interesting. I think Hoddle. Look, I mean, for me, Glenn Hoddle was one of the great players in a generation that then became, in my opinion, a very good manager. He obviously had his unfortunate remarks that cost him the England job, but then did a really phenomenal job with Southampton. Did a really phenomenal job with Spurs. Is a is, and we get there's a lot of criticism that very reflexively British or English pundits get, that they're very isolated in their thought process. They don't understand football from the continent, and I think that's the case with a lot of British analysts. I know it seems very stereotypical and maybe a little hipster to say that, but Hoddle doesn't have that problem at all. I think Hoddle, in terms of his footballing pedigree and the way he views the game, is much more comfortable in maybe Spain or Italy than in England. And I think that would have been actually a very nice addition. When I've seen him in studio, I don't think I've ever seen him as a co-commentator, but when I've seen him in studio, I think he's been quite good. Maybe underexposed. So I think I could have gone for that one. I think that would have been very good. And I think also Hoddle has an authoritative reputation among people who are very schooled in the sport. So I think that would have been a nice one. Yeah,
a very thought-provoking person in terms of reading the game, and that would have been a great addition. So, in completely unrelated news, Kartik, and I know you're a pet lover, dog lover, as am I. John Strong is back. If anyone missed this, John Strong was commentating this week. It wasn't a big football match. It was the Westminster Dog Show on Fox, on FS1. He was one of the commentators for. I think this is really peculiar. This is really strange that, I don't know, was this, something a passion that he's always wanted to do? Or is it, we've seen this more and more lately with a lot of Fox employees going ahead and doing different sports, if you can call dog shows a sport. But, I think Kate Abdo's doing the upcoming Fury boxing match, and Rob Stone's been doing anything and everything but soccer, it seems. There's many other ones too that have kind of been just been moved around in different places. This one I thought was just really strange to have John Strong doing a dog show.
That is quite peculiar. I guess since they've lost the Champions League, he's got a huge hole right in his schedule. He's not not doing Bundesliga matches anymore.
That's the thing, though. I thought about that too. Is like, what happened to him in the Bundesliga? Did it just become? He wouldn't do any games unless they're on Big Fox, or it just been? Keith Costigan's done such a fantastic job and is really more knowledgeable about that league and is better than John Strong. But maybe that's the reason why. It just seems it's been so long since we've heard John Strong calling a game.
I also think that you have to, since he is your lead commentator for the World Cup, the Men's World Cup, and for MLS, you don't want him to be overexposed maybe by doing games on FS2. So, maybe it is the Big Fox thing. Although, look, JP, I love, and he's a legend of the sport, and someone that I think we all owe a debt of gratitude to. But I still think it was kind of odd that John Strong wasn't a featured commentator during the Women's World Cup, and that was that's something we've all forgotten about it since. But then that when you consider his workload has already been lightened by lack of Champions League. Yes, there was the Gold Cup running simultaneously, but he's still your number one guy. And is he more now pegged to the idea of the U.S. men's national team, doing U.S. men's national team games and MLS matches than being your top soccer commentator, to where you would put someone else in if it's a different competition or a different team? So U.S. women's national team, you use Della Camera or whoever else, and if it's the Bundesliga, you're using Costigan. Very clearly, Costigan does all the big Bundesliga matches now.
Yeah, and John Strong now I think of as a MLS U.S. men's national team commentator, and that's it. And that's what he is a good fit for. And JP could do anything, but JP really focuses and specializes on the women's game. But it's almost like a chicken and egg thing, though. Too is that is it just because JP has done women's games that we will continue to have him do women's games? He could do anything he wanted to, as could John Strong. But John Strong's comfort level seems to be more with that crowd. I don't know. For me, it's just a bad career move doing a dog show. It's unless it's something that's been a burning passion all his life on his bucket list. Otherwise, it just cheapens his brand. Kartik, one more news item before we move on.
Yeah. So we have beIN Sports expanding their distribution of their free beIN Sports Extra channel with the announcement of a deal with Xumo TV. beIN Sports Extra joins the list of 190 plus channels on Xumo, currently available in 45 million U.S. households via smart TVs, mobile devices, web, and streaming boxes. Again, beIN Sports Extra doesn't have your. This is kind of an irony now, Chris. I think beIN Sports Extra with which would be kind of like your NBC Sports Gold, your spillover games, etc. ESPN Plus is I think now probably available in more U.S. homes than beIN Sports itself is.
For sure. Yeah, for sure. Well, available in more homes. So that's the kicker. I mean, if you have a Roku, I mean, there's tons of people who have Rokus. They may not realize that they have the opportunity to add the beIN Sports Extra channel for free with no ads. Same thing with the Xumo TV, as you mentioned. Same thing for the Samsung Plus. So if you have a newer Samsung Smart TV, you now have the potential, the opportunity to go ahead and add the beIN Sports Extra channel for free and watch that. Now, so the universe of people that have access to that channel is much greater. The number of people actually watching that channel, we don't have those numbers, but at this point, I would imagine would be pretty small because it's going to take time to get the word out that you can watch this channel for free. And then even then, you can't watch the Barca games or Real Madrid games or Atleti games on it. It's going to be selective programming, some live, some matches, but then also other sports, some stuff that's tape delay, etc. The concept is good. I mean, in terms of marketing, beIN Sports, and then maybe realizing that they're not going to get anywhere with DirecTV and Comcast, is saying, okay, well, if we can't go through those guys, let's go it alone and let's just go direct to consumer with a free model and get into more homes. So that way, when we talk to advertisers, we can say, hey, yeah, we're not on Comcast, we're not on DirecTV, but we are on 100 million homes with beIN Sports Extra. And that's something they're in complete control of. All right, Kartik, let's move on to TV ratings. Speaking of beIN Sports, this is something I just want to pay attention to because, like, up until maybe about 2 months ago, we weren't sure what the beIN Sports viewing numbers were. A lot of the games were numbers that we weren't able to actually access those numbers. Recently, though, beIN Sports has been giving us some of those numbers to share with us. And the reality is that these numbers are really, really good. I mean, I'm really positive about these numbers, especially considering, I mean, the distribution of this channel. That it's not on DirecTV, it's not on Comcast. Those are the two biggest TV providers in the United States. So you would imagine that the numbers for the games that they have would be tiny. And if you ask social media about beIN Sports, if you go into Reddit or you go into Twitter and talk about beIN Sports, most of the people will start complaining about, I don't have access to it, or that channel stinks, or is it still around? Those types of things. The numbers say otherwise. So just some of the recent games that we've had, Real Betis against Barcelona, this on Sunday, 353,000 viewers for this one. Barcelona against Levante, I think that was the week before, 332,000 viewers for that. Osasuna against Real Madrid this past weekend, 207,000. And then you look at some of the other clubs too. They're not Barca and not Real Madrid, and even those numbers are pretty decent too. Atleti against Granada on Saturday, 124,000 viewers. And then Celta de Vigo against Sevilla, this was this past Sunday, 109,000 viewers. So if you compare those, Kartik, to Major League Soccer numbers on FS1 as one example, those numbers compare really, really well. If anything, the Barca numbers are much greater than Major League Soccer numbers on an FS1 or oftentimes an ESPN.
Yeah. That's a stunner, really, when you think about it, because the distribution, again, of beIN Sports, we just talked about this in the last segment, is really low. And when now you're getting beIN Sports and Espanol numbers, you're realizing these numbers are higher. Now, again, their Barcelona matches. But then let's think about even getting over 100,000 for the Atleti Granada match at a time when Atleti is just unwatchable. Really.
Yeah.
So that was. I think that was pretty interesting. This is, I think, a very, very, very disappointing kind of development for MLS long term. We'll see how it plays out, because I've actually pushed back against your arguments about MLS TV ratings, Chris, by saying, well, it's really only just Liga MX and the Premier League, right? Mm-hmm. And the Premier League, as has been pointed out by me and by others, Jonathan Wilson among them, is more popular than the domestic league in just about every country where English is predominantly spoken. We've seen attendance drops in countries that speak English that have access to the Premier League. At least we haven't seen that here. MLS's attendance is still very, very good. But if we're beginning to see La Liga numbers overtake MLS numbers, and maybe they've always been ahead, we just haven't had reliable data, that's a bigger concern, and I think one that is not easily solvable or reversible. So let's keep an eye on this now that we're getting these numbers. I also want to mention that over 100,000 for Bayern Leipzig on FS2. That is a really good number, and again makes me worry about next season with the Bundesliga on ESPN Plus, because this match would be an ESPN Plus match next season, not a match that's accessible on a cable channel. So,
all right, Kartik,
just another thing to think about.
I got some big news. So I have a contact at ESPN Plus, and so I was able to find out some of the numbers recently of some of the games, and none of these have been published. But according to my source, the numbers for some of these recent games, the Milan Derby is one perfect example, exclusively on ESPN Plus, were probably greater than the Bundesliga is getting. Like, for example, this Bayern Munich against RB Leipzig, the 0-0 game was 113,000 viewers. The numbers on ESPN are close, if not greater, maybe a little bit in the ballpark of that number. And that's big news, Kartik, because we talk about ESPN Plus and how many millions of subscribers they have and the accelerated growth. The concern is, though, that we were thinking but how many people are actually watching soccer? Because we don't know. Those numbers haven't been released. But what does that tell you?
Well, if the numbers are accurate, it tells me that's very good news, I think, for the sport and for as we make this move from linear television to streaming and digital platforms. It's very, very positive news. Now, I'd still like to see more evidence of that. I watched the Milan Derby, and I think a lot of people did. I think that's an exceptional example, but I want to see what happens going forward, because I'm concerned. Yeah. Again, I'm partial to the Bundesliga. I admit that openly. They say it's football as it's meant to be. I kind of buy into that marketing slogan. That's why I like the league so much. I'm not claiming it's a better league than the Premier League or La Liga. I relate more to the community ownership structure. I am, as I have expressed on numerous occasions on this podcast and in writing, concerned about the Bundesliga being off of linear television and onto a streaming platform behind a paywall. So that's encouraging. That's very encouraging to hear.
I share those concerns, but given the numbers I've seen, I'm actually looking optimistically a little bit now in terms of the future for the Bundesliga on ESPN Plus, especially for the big games. I mean, the Bayern Munich against RB Leipzig, and it's just a shame, though, Kartik. I honestly feel this way, but whenever there's a big match in the Bundesliga where it's one of those games, like a must-see game that people have to tune into, over the past several years when it's been on Fox, and this is just coincidence, but sure, I mean, tons of bad luck. It's either been a 0-0 game. I mean, a lot of the Der Klassikers where there was a lot of hype and expectation, it'd be a 0-0 game, or it'd be a drubbing. It would be Bayern Munich beating Dortmund like 5-0, and the game would have been over by like the middle of the first half. And I'm sure, that doesn't hold the viewer. I mean, this 0-0 game was an entertaining game for sure, and Red Bull Leipzig should have won this game, really. But
it was a very, very entertaining game. I mean, it was arguably the best 0-0 game I've seen in a long time. And my fear, so when I was trying to tell people, hey, you need to watch this match instead of watching the Premier League or whatever else is on at the same time, people were citing to me exactly what you just said. Oh, well, it'll be like Dortmund-Bayern. Every time Dortmund is threatening Bayern in the table and they play, it's 5-0 or it's 6-1, and they're right.
Yeah.
But Nagelsmann is not Favre or Bosch or Stoger or Tuchel. He came in and had a clear game plan to pressure Bayern and to create space on the counterattack. He had shuffled his first 11 a little bit in order to accommodate that tactic. We know Nagelsmann is maybe one of the top two or three really young, top 2 or 3 young managers in the world. So this was, but as the commentators had talked about, as it was Costigan and Ian Joy had talked about, Nagelsmann, for all his accolades, he had never been in a match of this magnitude before, and he passed the test. Yep. So I think the manager made a difference. But you're absolutely right, Chris. What you said is exactly what people told me before when they said, I'm not going to watch this game because it's going to be 5-0. It's just like when Dortmund plays. You're just subbing out Dortmund and adding RB Leipzig. Now, after the match, some of those same people come back to me and said, oh, yeah, maybe we should have watched. Maybe you're right. Maybe we'll keep an eye on Leipzig the rest of the season.
Yeah, I mean, the Bundesliga and Fox is just not a good fit for so many different reasons. One of the reasons is just that the Bundesliga can get no luck, it seems, when there are those big games, and the games usually underwhelm, or the scoreline underwhelms. It's hard to get in the casual fan, to get them excited when it's a 0-0. For the hardcore audience like yourself and I and our listeners, yeah, we can appreciate a 0-0 game. Just this past weekend, one of my girls' travel games, one of the parents came up to me at the end of the game and said, okay, this was a 2-2 draw, but okay, we go to penalty kicks now, right? And I'm like, no, it's a league game, it's a draw. And they couldn't get their heads wrapped around the whole concept of just a draw. And I said, well, that's a probably fair result based on the two teams and how well they played. But going back to the Bundesliga, it's not a good fit because, Kartik, this was a huge opportunity on the Premier League. Man City against West Ham postponed due to weather conditions and because of the storm. Okay, so you have no game on at the 11:30 to 1:30 block. The only other game that was on, I think, on that Sunday morning, I think it was it Osasuna against Real Madrid from 10 till noon. So at noon, there's no competition. You have the biggest game of the day. You have the biggest game, top of the table clash. You have the biggest game in the Bundesliga this season. And it's on FS2. And I'm like, oh, come on. But even with it being on FS2, that number should have been much greater. I mean, FS2 is still in 52 million homes. I mean, that's. I think beIN Sports probably at this point is probably in about 12 million homes. But Atleti against Granada gets more viewers on beIN Sports and beIN Sports en Español than the biggest game in the Bundesliga. People, I just think in terms of where we are with Fox, the Bundesliga would never succeed. And going to ESPN is a long-term bet, and it could pay out in the future. But the starting block of where they're at, I think ESPN Plus is actually going to be a good thing for the Bundesliga. And that's not because I'm a big critic of Fox, but I think that ESPN Plus will give them more love. And no matter what, if you have FS2 or if you don't have FS2, or with ESPN Plus for $5 a month, you have access to every single game. All right, Kartik, let's move on to listener mailbag. First up is Sir Digby. While it seems only one team in the Premier League has been consistent and moved forward, I wouldn't say that it isn't entertaining. Everyone outside of the Liverpool have been susceptible to losing to anyone. Norwich match against City. The blame gets put on teams playing poorly, but that can't always be the case. I'd argue the quality of the bottom half of the table has increased. Happily Eggs says, this season you can feel...
I'll just jump in on that real quickly, is that if you listen to things like the Guardian podcast, they actually disagree. They think that they haven't seen... Now, I'm not sure I agree with them, but I was listening to Russian's pod last week or the week before when they talked about, him and Glendenning were talking about the bottom of the table being really bad in England this year in the top flight. I think it was worse a few seasons ago, including the season you guys, Swansea, stayed in the league, right, with the late run under Paul Clement. But I don't think it's particularly particularly good, though. I think the Norwich versus Man City result was early in the season, and it's kind of a one-off. We haven't seen too many more of those, if any. I mean, you can pick up any isolated result like that in any league. I mean, Paderborn just drew Schalke in the Bundesliga. Schalke was trying to qualify for the Champions League. That was just kind of a stunning result at Schalke. But I think every league has those sorts of results. I mean, even Verona beating Juventus this week. I mean, that was a stunner.
That's huge. Yeah, I agree. And I think I would disagree with Sir Digby, and I agree with you, Kartik, is that the bottom half of the table is pretty poor. Inconsistent is probably a better word. I mean, some weeks they're putting in good performances. But again, going back to last week's show, to me, what we're missing in the Premier League from about 3 down to 20 positions is creativity, is something exciting, something different that's going to separate you from the other teams. And we're not seeing as much of that this season as we have in previous years. Happily Eggs says, this season you can throw a blanket over 5th to 17th. It's very tight. 4th place is not guaranteed for Chelsea, Wolves, Spurs, Man United, Everton, not to forget newcomers, Sheffield United, are all fighting for 5th to 6th. Statistically, 2nd, 3rd and 4th place teams are on a par, points-wise, with previous years. It's only because Liverpool are so far ahead. It gives the appearance of teams where the performance has dropped off. The reality is, other than that, the other teams are on course for a standard season. Liverpool are on course for an outstanding season. John Average Geek, and this is in terms of talking about the Premier League and just... it's been several weeks of some poor play for the most part, other than the Liverpools and maybe the Leicesters of the world. But John Average Geek says, never underestimate the power of fantasy, sports and gambling to draw viewers to a league. And this would go back directly to talking about the viewing figures. I think it was for Man United against Wolves, over 1 million viewers for that match, which was a really dire match to watch. JB says, I was in Mexico this past week and was surprised at how much coverage the FA Cup was getting on Mexican ESPN and Fox. FA Cup stories were number 1 slot over La Liga. How big is British soccer in Mexico? Am I right in assuming La Liga is bigger? Kartik, do you want to take this one? I mean, from personal experience, I've been to Mexico City. I've been to Central America. I mean, La Liga. I mean, Barcelona and Real Madrid are much bigger than any Premier League team. But I don't know if you have any experience with this one. The FA Cup, that's interesting, though.
That is very interesting. I mean, my experience in Mexico was that at the time, the Bundesliga was kind of big because there were always Mexican players in the Bundesliga, and people watched PSV because and the Portuguese league, they followed that. I think La Liga is bigger than the Premier League in Mexico, but maybe not by that much. I think that there's been an interest in the Premier League that accelerated when Chicharito went to Manchester United, and that was at first I thought it was just a marketing move. It turned out he was really good in terms of just his ability to poach goals. But I think that grew the interest in English football in Mexico, and then obviously the signing of Raul Jimenez. Now, when Jared Borghetti went to Bolton under Sam Allardyce, the thought was that would accelerate interest in the Premier League in Mexico. It didn't at that point. But now I think there's just a general interest in things that there's an integration. I know there's all these political discussions about walls and such, but there's a very much kind of an integration culturally of what some people in Mexico do culturally and Americans do. And I think the Premier League probably has a greater foothold because of that in Mexico than they do in the rest of Latin America. I know in South America, there are parts of South America where people don't watch the Premier League at all. The only part of the world really where that happens, because the Premier League is strong everywhere else. And again, English is spoken as a second or third language, or as a language of lingua franca of business, just about everywhere in the world outside of Latin America. The exception being Brazil. A lot of your business people in Brazil speak English, and I think because there have been so many more Premier League players from Brazil in recent years. Remember, years ago it was just Gilberto Silva on Arsenal and Juninho on Middlesbrough. There were very few Brazilian players. A lot more Brazilian players in in the Netherlands and in Germany, among Northern European countries. Now, I think the combination of English being more widespread as a language that's spoken in Brazil than it is in the rest of South America, and just the number of Brazilian players that are making huge impacts, starting with Roberto Firmino, it has made the Premier League much more popular in Brazil, from what I understand.
Next up is KTK. KTK says, did you guys catch the segment NBCSN aired in the pre-match coverage on Sunday morning with the new Premier League chairman, Richard Masters? I guess he was the acting interim one, but those were his first media comments. He talked about the Premier League moving the summer transfer window or deadline back to September 1st to match the rest of Europe, the introduction of VAR, racism, etc. Kartik, I missed this one because this was the morning of the Sheffield United Bournemouth game pre-match, and I missed the pre-match. Did you catch this one?
Yeah, I saw it, and I think this is something that NBCSN, it was good. They made some news, and it was an exclusive they got as a Premier League rights holder. It's also something that they're going to have to do more of now with Neil Ashton serving as Ed Woodward's personal PR flag. They don't have anyone to give them that insight on air.
Which is true.
Sorry, I know that was
it's true. It's true. It's very true. I mean,
pretty sad. Honestly, for a guy like Ashton, who I think everybody likes and respects.
Yeah, and it's a tough job to do. I mean, he's got a lot of work ahead of him, Neil Ashton, to really kind of repair the image of Ed Woodward and the club Manchester United, and taking him on as your first client. That's really difficult. But I'm sure from Neil Ashton's point of view too, there's I'm sure he'd make more money doing that than he is as a football editor, and long term it could be a successful company for him. So it's an interesting first client. If he can succeed with this one, I think he's got a lot of success in his future. Shane Rowe says, for anyone who's interested, the Caribbean Club Championship streams on the CONCACAF website for free. Also, from my own research, I think it's only the US that doesn't have promotion relegation. I'm tired of the excuses about how there's no infrastructure. If Cuba, of all places, have it, there's no reason why the world's biggest economy cannot. Raymond Orozco says, Craig Burley and Steve Nicol have great chemistry. The only problem is sometimes the Scottish accent comes out with unusual British expressions I'm not familiar with. Gonzalo says,
yeah, they had a go at each other this past week on God, I can't remember because those shows run into one another, but on was it on Barcelona and the transfer this idea of the transfer window reopening, and some of these expressions came out, and I think most of the audience in the US had no idea what they were saying to one another, but yeah.
Gonzalo says, enjoy the podcast. For those who are not familiar with Brian Dunseth, who was on the US men's national team broadcast with Adrian Healy, he is one of the regular hosts of SiriusXM FC's afternoon show, Counterattack. I enjoy hearing him with Tony Meola and also his sparring with one of the producers on that show, Andrew Williams. Have you guys ever discussed SiriusXM FC's call-in shows on your podcast? I'd like to hear your thoughts on their programming. So, Kartik, it's been a few years since I've had Sirius XM FC, and for the most part, I was underwhelmed. It's changed since then. At the time, they had a lot of simulcast of Talk Sport. So I think from maybe maybe 2 p.m. to 4 p.m., they had Talk Sport on. And for the most part, while I appreciate Talk Sport at times, most of the time I get really just fed up with their programming, because it is very it's very basic. It's very transfer rumor gossip. It's a lot of it is just nonsense. A lot of it seems to be kind of just filling air, filling time with just nonsensical arguments, and people like Adrian Durham just saying something outlandish just to get a reaction, to get people calling in to argue with him. So anyway, going back to SiriusXM FC, when they've had the Talk Sport simulcast on, I think that was really, I wasn't really not interested at all in those. The Grumpy Pundits I thought were good, and also the show with Ray Hudson and Charlie Stilitano was interesting at times. Wasn't a fan of all the people that they have on the show as far as some of the regular guests. And then in the evenings when they had the Eric Ronaldo show, I thought that was the best thing on SiriusXM FC. Here was somebody with some really honest, critical opinions with authority, talking about the game. And that I enjoyed. I think that was the best thing they had going, and then that ended. So that's my take on it. I'm not a fan. And again, it's different strokes for different folks, and there's probably some good shows on there now that maybe weren't on there before, but for the most part, I'm not interested. What about you, Kartik?
Yeah, I mean, I've listened to Times. I like Dunny a lot. I think there's some okay shows on there, but I think it's kind of generic. Not having Eric Winalda, and again, Eric Winalda left to go coach, right? And that's something he had been waiting for an opportunity to coach. But not having Eric Winalda on there means that you don't really have the sort of opinionated and oftentimes grounded in reality, in fact, analysis of American soccer that you would have otherwise. The thing about when all those criticisms is that I think the audience of that particular channel didn't take well to them. So I think what Sirius XMFC has attracted is a much more kind of U.S. soccer fan, MLS fan audience than the more critical thinking fans. Now maybe they tune in every now and then for Ronaldo's show, but the feedback I got always, Chris, was that people were so offended by what Eric Winalda said on the air. Mm-hmm. And the other shows on that specific channel would often, the pro U.S. soccer shows would often just work on undoing what he said for the next however many days. Right.
And God forbid people get offended by opinions. I mean, there are opinions, and they're they're not insults. They're not. I don't know. I don't have time for kind of those propaganda just rah things. And
the Winalda thing is really weird, Chris, because, and I understand some of the drawbacks in Eric Winalda's personality and some of the criticisms of him, but at the same time, there seems to be like a universal paranoia about him and this fear of him, just delusional fear of him within the U.S. soccer aristocracy, so to speak, that I thought was really kind of unhealthy. I mean, it reminds me of the way the Democrats act towards Bernie Sanders. I mean, it's the same thing, really. That just kind of the same sort of just venom and anger towards one of their own. I mean, this is one of the for years was the all-time leading goal scorer in U.S. history, and really in that era, maybe other than Tabaré Ramos, our most technical player. Attacking player, at least.
And I would say, I think a lot of the kind of negativity that others would have expressed, or uneasiness with his show, would be because of change. Is because the things he was talking about was, okay, we've got this massive country, we've got incredible population, incredible opportunities in this country. Why aren't we the best soccer nation in this world? Like, what's holding us back? Let's talk about some of the changes that we can make to improve. And that creates fear among some people, especially in certain circles, where they're like, oh, holy cow. I mean, you have to change everything to actually kind of improve. And I think that's part of it too, is that it shakes things up. And Eric Winalda's had an interesting career broadcast-wise, where there's been lots of highs, but there's been lots of lows. That the lows were sometimes the times where he was almost held back, it seems, when he was on Fox, where he did some interviews, I think, with Sepp Blatter and Gianni Infantino. I think Gianni maybe perhaps one of the first interviews. But it seems so scripted. It seems so that he was held back and say, okay, yeah, you can't just go off and ask some tough questions. Let's ask some simple questions, softball questions, get softball answers. Now, when he was unchained and people said, okay, give him the time to go ahead and analyze this game, or give him the time to go ahead and talk about ways to improve soccer in the United States and how we can be a better soccer nation, then he was spectacular. Then to me, I would listen in and go, wow, this guy really knows his stuff. He's able to communicate it really effectively, but also he's got some great ideas. And these are great ideas, ideas that haven't seen the light of day in terms of none of these have changed. Going back to a lot of my frustration in terms of just the way that US soccer as a whole, whether it's on the national side or the club level or the league level, has been run. It just missed opportunities for this country to be one of the greatest countries in the world from a soccer perspective, and we're nowhere near that. Alf says, shame because promotion relegation does add to the season. Instead of a load of pointless end-of-the-season games, you get crucial crunch games. I guess that they just don't get that fans can celebrate finishing fourth bottom. If your team has been in the bottom three all season and on the last day scrapes to fourth from bottom to stay up, then trust me, you will celebrate as if you've just won the league. Ho-hum, it'll stay as half the league goes to the playoffs. Playoffs are that put up against the start of the NFL season, then they wonder why viewing figures are so poor. Nick says, first off, I would like to start by saying I appreciate all your dedication and hard work. I enjoy listening to your podcast on the way to and from work, making it one of my favorites. As a passionate sports fan, I always need to find the balance between other sports and football. It would almost be impossible without streaming. Accessibility has really changed the landscape. LaLiga is an afterthought, mostly due to beIN Sports' limitations, and haven't missed it at all. The Premier League is more of a background noise while you scroll on social media, listening for statistics or highlights, much like SportsCenter. I find no value in Serie A personally, or bother keeping up with the table standings in Ligue 1. MLS is most certainly out of the question unless it's Atlanta United or LAFC. ESPN Plus is my go-to source for football matches. I'd rather watch Ajax against PSV, Leeds United versus West Brom, or AIK versus Malmo, and then forcing myself to watch a predictable Burnley versus Arsenal, PSG versus Marseille, or NYCFC versus San Jose Earthquakes match. Time is valuable for a full-blown sports fan. There's no time to waste. Wow, Kartik, I really like that. That's some great feedback there for Nick.
Yeah,
and,
great comment there.
Yeah,
a lot to think about there.
Yeah, especially with ESPN Plus having so many different leagues and competitions, you could really go down different paths and watch a ton of stuff that you would normally not watch and normally not have access to. Steve Stupka says, hello, I want to chime in on ESPN Plus. I am thrilled that the Bundesliga is coming to ESPN Plus. I've never had a cord to cut, so ESPN has brought me my favorite clubs, Phoenix Rising, Fiorentina, Forward Madison, and some Hull City and Dortmund games. The sooner they take over the rest of the world, the better for me. I can only catch some Everton and Valencia games now. Maybe not catching all the Everton games is better for my health, but I digress. By the way, I don't watch leagues as much as teams in leagues. One more note. I can follow local athletes. I watch Evansville women every now and again. And then because the guy in the office next to me has a sister that plays for them, remember, this is for $5 a month. John Average Geek says, with ESPN and Fox backing XFL, I see Major League Soccer next rights going to CBS and NBC. Now, Kartik, from the opening weekend of XFL, the viewing numbers for this were again strong. I think the lowest number that they had was 2.5 million for one of the games, and I think the highest was about 3.5 million or 4 million viewers. Huge numbers. I disagree with John Average Geek, though, saying that the next rights will go to CBS and NBC. I don't think NBC is interested. CBS would be interested, but I still see it sticking with Fox, ESPN, and Univision. And if there's a game on Big Fox that's an XFL game, they can put MLS on FS1 or FS2. Same thing with ESPN. If there's a big XFL game on ESPN, the normal channel, they can put it on ESPN2 or ESPN News or something. So there's a lot of opportunities.
If XFL is even still around. Look, I know they had huge ratings when they were on NBC and Turner, like the first few weeks in 2001, and the league didn't make it through even and ended after that first season. We saw the Alliance of American Football, or whatever it was called, last year, had some decent numbers the first few weeks and then just completely tailed off. So I don't know. I'm pretty dubious about any attempt at American football in the spring. So we'll see. I think there's a better than 50-50 chance that when the rights renewal comes up for MLS or the XFL doesn't exist any longer.
Next up is Bill Reese. Bill says, was wondering what the host's favorite apps are for catching up on games. As the dad of a toddler, I'm often too busy to watch European games live or on weekend mornings. I will often record them and catch up later. I'm a fan of Fubo's tablet app, where you can swipe forward 10 to 15 seconds. When you skip ahead 10 seconds before every throw-in or before every goal kick, I can cut out a lot of the downtime in the match. I can sometimes watch an entire game in a little more than an hour, precisely the amount of time that my son's midday naps usually last. So for me, Kartik, you probably actually have better insight on this one, but for me personally, almost all the games I watch are live. It's very rare. I love this job, being able to stay at home and watch games throughout the week. And on an average week, I think a couple of weeks ago, I watched like 16 games live. And that's just on TV or streaming. That didn't include going to my kids' games or practices and things like that. So it's rare. I know back in the day when I had a 9-to-5 job, I would... This would have been during the days of TiVo, and I would try to do the same thing that Bill talked about, fast forward during throw-ins or goal kicks, and I was horrible at it. I would miss goals and have to rewind, and then it was a mess. I just was a disaster. But yeah, the Fubo app is a good one to be able to fast forward a lot more effectively. But what about you, Kartik? Any tips that you have in terms of catching up on games?
Yeah, so the FOTMOB app, FOTMOB on iOS devices and on Android is fantastic, and then you kind of pick your leagues and go from there and get live updates. There's also the ability on the Eurosport app to keep up on, and Eurosport's of course a news app, but to keep up on live scores on there. And then I also believe Soccerway might have an app. I use Soccerway online to check scores. That's a Dutch site, but I think they might have a Android and iOS app as well, but they give you some very good live updates. And then you kind of, if you're DVR'd a match, what the score is, and that's sometimes, now maybe I'm unusual in this, sometimes having spoilers are good because that compels me to go back and watch it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Soccerway was acquired a few years ago by Goal. Goal.com. So
that's right.
So if you go to soccerway.com, it still works to get like live scores and scores for the day. But on the app, I think it's been renamed to Goal Live, which is effectively the same thing, except that it's just a different name. Last but not least, Chris Hardy says, recently BR Football said that Barcelona player, Abidal said that many players weren't satisfied or working a lot. But Marca says, he said, many players were not satisfied or working hard, and there was an internal communication issue. Messi too had different quotes. Messi said, according to BR Football, when you talk about players, you should give names, because if not, they are tarnishing all of us. Marcus says, finally, I think what Messi said, finally, I think that when talking about players' names should be given, because if not, we are tarred with comments that are said and not true. Why are these quotes worded differently? Sorry, this is long, but it's been bugging me. And Kartik, from you and I having experience being in press conferences, interviewing players and executives, there's a few different reasons for this. What's your first take on this one?
Well, this one in particular was stunning, and I think just shook up the entire football world this week. The rationale seemed to be, one, Messi's contract technically is up in the summer, right? And he could walk on a free, right? This is what we're aware of. Abidal, there's been all kinds of, I think, just since Valverde got sacked, all kinds of different issues within the Barcelona community, and I still don't have an explanation for this. Why he did this? Why he didn't name names? What exactly the situation is in terms of that would prompt him to make these comments? But the backlash has been enormous. We don't know how this is going to shake out in terms of. Keep in mind, Barcelona is a membership-driven club. The presidency is voted on. The supporters have a role in everything, and this just hasn't gone over very well, and it's become I mean, it's funny. It's the end of the show, and we haven't discussed this yet on the show, but this has been the big issue that people have been talking about in football this week. Has been this particular situation.
And going back to Chris's question specifically, though, is why are these quotes different? And that's a lot of it because, like, for example, it's unlikely that BR Football even had a reporter in that press conference. So what they're doing is taking information secondhand. So it's either secondhand through another source. Maybe it's another site that reported the quote, and then they take that quote and then translate that into English. And that quote may not translate well into English, or you could have two different translators translating that slightly differently. The other thing, too, from experience in terms of being in a press conference or doing an interview and recording the audio versus somebody writing it, typing it into a laptop, what I do is I record everything and then go sit down and transcribe it word for word, which takes painstakingly long. It takes, sometimes hours to transcribe something that's pretty short, just because I want to make sure that I got everything exactly right. Others are not like that. Sometimes they'll just type on the laptop. You'll hear the laptop's clicking away as they actually type in what they say. So sometimes the meaning can be different depending on actually who was transcribing it, either in their minds what they remember him saying versus word for word. There's probably some other examples too, but that and also telephone. I mean, in terms of, one person says something, you pass it along to somebody else, and then somebody else reports it, and then before you know it, those words can actually change a little bit. So there's a lot of different factors there. So Chris, that's the reason why sometimes you'll see quotes done differently, saying similar things but a little bit different, and sometimes those differences can have big ramifications in terms of what the player was intending to say. All right, Kartik, well, that's been a pretty fun-filled, action-packed listener mailbag. Listeners, if you do have anything you want to share with us, any questions you have about streaming, television, soccer, of course, and any thoughts or observations or anything that we missed or any interesting talking points, let us know. We want you to have your say. You can always reach us via email through web at worldsoccertalk.com, as well as facebook.com/worldsoccertalk, and on Twitter at worldsoccertalk. Plus, of course, you can always post your comments on worldsoccertalk.com. Now, Kartik, before we go into the closing segment, a big weekend coming up. Anything in particular that you're going to be, any match that you would recommend for the viewers to keep an eye on?
Yeah, I think this weekend it's going to be really interesting as I go forward looking at Leeds United. They're playing Bristol City this weekend in the championship. I'm not sure if that's an ESPN Plus match, but that's the match I'm keeping the closest eye on. Leeds United in a terrible run of form lately. They are still sitting second in an automatic promotion spot in the championship, but they've got Fulham, Brentford, Nottingham Forest, and one or two others that are escaping me, nipping at their heels. As I think about this now, I think it's your game that's on. I think it's a Swansea match that might be on ESPN Plus. Swansea is in an even worse run of form than Leeds, so they need to snap out of it too. So maybe watch that match. Yeah,
so that's on Friday, the 2:45 game Eastern time. Oh God! Anytime they're on ESPN Plus, they play awful. So I'm not looking forward to that one.
I watched them against QPR. They were dreadful. They got a point.
Yeah, but come on, it's QPR. It's so the Bristol City Leeds game is not on ESPN Plus. You can, if you do want to watch it, LUTV, which is Leeds United TV, they offer a match day pass, so you can watch each game individually if you want to, or you can subscribe to their streaming service to have access to the games that are not on ESPN Plus. For me, Kartik, I think it's this weekend. I think West Brom's playing Nottingham Forest in the Championship. This one's going to be on Saturday, 12:30, I think, Eastern time. And that's one that, West Brom's such a good team. And Forest still, out of all the teams I've seen in the Championship this season, Nottingham Forest has been the one that's impressed me the most. I saw them in person in September when they played Swansea and beat them. But they're really organised, good shape, and they're not going to score a ton of goals, but they're a difficult team to beat. and West Brom is still a really entertaining team that I think will go up this season, but they've still got a lot of work to do. Okay, listeners, thank you for listening. You can get a new episode of the World Soccer Talk podcast every Thursday. Every episode is released on SoundCloud, Spotify, Pandora, YouTube, Stitcher, TuneIn, iTunes, Audio Boom, Overcast. Podfollow is a new one that we've added to, and of course worldsoccertalk.com. If you like the show, share it with your friends on social media and give us a review on iTunes. Oftentimes we will read those reviews out on air, so feel free to be honest, whether it's honest criticism or some plaudits or negative, whatever it is, read those out on air, give us those reviews. And Kartik, heading into another weekend of football around the world, what should they do?
Enjoy your football.